All right, welcome back to the video series on making a space shooter in using the arcade library. In this video, we're going to be getting some enemies to appear on the screen and hopefully get the ability to have them shoot, and then we'll see where we go from there. So the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and create another class, and this class is going to look very similar to player in some respects. So I'm just going to call this class enemy, and it's going to subclass sprite. Again, I'm going to go ahead and write my init method, and it's going to take in an x and a y. Super.init, and this one. Now, so for this one, in the starter code, I actually have different enemies. I've got 3 different enemies. Okay, so what I want to do is when an enemy gets created, I'm going to have it take in enemy number. So it's like 1, 2, or 3. So it'll be f images / enemy num .png. So that should be the file type. And then we're going to go ahead and set the center x to x and the center y to y. We're going to have to scale it. I'm going to make it the same scale as my player. It's going to need a lasers list, and we're going to go ahead and set the shot speed to, I'll make it 10 as well. Okay. So we have our enemies class, or enemy class, and so inside of our game class, I'm going to have self.enemies. I'm going to set that to none, and then inside of setup, we're going to go ahead and say self.enemies equals a arcade.sprite list. Now the reason I'm using a sprite list here is because when I get to the onDraw, I can now just say self.enemies.draw, and it's going to automatically go through every sprite in that list. And likewise, I can say self.enemies.update, and it will automatically go through and call each of their update methods. It simplifies things a little bit. Right now, we don't actually have it creating any enemies. So just to test things out, I'm going to go ahead and make an enemy. I'm going to say self.enemies.append an enemy, and let's make it at the top of the screen. So that would be let's make the top center. So it would be screen width divided by 2, screen height, say -50, and then let's make it enemy number 2. So now if we run this, there we go, we have an enemy. And of course if we shoot it, nothing happens, but there we go. Okay, cool. So now we want to write that enemy's update method. We want that enemy to be moving basically back and forth across the screen, shooting at our player, but also maybe moving closer to our player, right? So it should go back and forth across the screen, but then every so often it should also move forward. So I'll go ahead and write my update method. We want this thing to move left to right. So we're going to go ahead and call supers update. And let's just get it moving. Let's just have it self.change x equals, let's make it move about the same speed as the player, equals 5. Right? But then what we'll do is inside of update, if self.centerx, if it's reached the edge in either direction, then we're going to have it come forward and then go back the opposite direction. Okay, so if self.centerx is greater than screen width, or self.centerx is less than 0, right, then what we'll do is we'll say self.centery plus equals 5, and self.changex times equals -1. But now if we run this, we should see it moving. There we go. Oh, but it's moving away. So, okay, remember in arcade, minus is down. So this should be minus equals. And I think I probably want to move a little bit faster than that down. So I'm going to say minus equals 10. So let's see what happens here. Okay, so it's moving closer. Cool. All right. So far so good. Next thing I want the enemy to be able to do is I want it to shoot. I want to shoot a laser. And so I'm going to go ahead and write a shoot method. And that shoot method is actually going to be very similar to my player shoot method. So I'm going to copy this code from my player shoot method and paste it here. But instead of player laser, it's going to be enemy laser. And instead of center Y plus 50, which would be above, I want it to be Y minus 50. And then, let's see, we're going to shot speed 10, append shot. Cool. So now if we run this, and then you know what, so to test it, let's go ahead and say on update, let's go ahead and determine, we don't want to shoot all the time, but let's say it shoots sort of randomly, right? So I don't want it to be exactly random, but I'm going to go ahead and do import random. And what we're going to do is we're going to say if the length of self.lasers is less than 5, so in other words, if there's fewer than 5 shots already out for this particular, and we may need to change that, but if it's less than 5, then let's go ahead and let's like kind of flip a coin, except for it's not going to be a coin, it's going to be like let's make it like a 5% chance of shooting, right? So we'll say if random.randint from 1 to 100 is less than or equal to 5, then self.shoot. Okay. Now, in the same way that our player's update had to remove stuff from shooting, we're going to do the same right here. I'm going to say, exactly this. Well, there'll be one difference. So make our list to remove for shot in self.lasers, update it. If the center Y is less than 0, then we'll remove it. All right, so now he's not shooting. It's the same problem we had with player, right? We didn't tell it to draw this stuff, so we need to write a draw method. So draw self super dot draw, and then we're going to say for laser in self dot lasers laser dot draw. Okay, he's still not shooting. Let's just try this. For enemy in self dot enemies enemy dot draw. There it is. Okay. So what that means is that even though enemies is a sprite list, when we go to draw it, it's not actually calling the draw method for the enemy class. So that's interesting. So this is how we're going to have to do it. Okay, so I've got for enemy and self.enemies, enemy.draw. Okay, there we go. So now we're getting shots. Okay, cool. And we can see that he's getting closer and he's shooting randomly. Now we're going to go ahead and get it so that when we hit the enemy with the laser, the enemy goes away. So inside of my on update, what we're going to do is we're going to check for collision between each enemy in our enemies list and our lasers. Now, in order to use the method we're going to use, which is going to be arcade.check for collision with list. In order for that to work, we need the thing we're checking for collision with to be a sprite and a sprite list, which means we need to go back into our player class and change lasers to a sprite list. And likewise for our enemy, we're going to change our lasers to a sprite list. So make that change before continuing on. All right, so self lasers equals arcade sprite list for enemy, and then for player, self lasers equals arcade sprite list. And so now we're going to check for collision with list, but we want to check between each enemy and between the player's laser list. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to say for each enemy in self.enemies. Okay, now arcade.check for collision with list actually returns a list, and it's going to return a list of the lasers that collided. So I'm just going to say hit list. Okay. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, so if hit list is greater than 0, in other words, if this enemy collided with any of my lasers, then we want to remove that enemy from the enemies list. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here, I'm going to make a list to remove, an empty list. I'm going to say to remove dot append enemy. So if it got hit, then go ahead and append it. And then after this for loop, I'm going to say for enemy in to remove self.enemies.remove enemy. Okay, so that's going to go through this to remove list, which is all the enemies that we want to get rid of because they just got hit, and it should take them out of our enemies list. So now I'm going to go ahead and run this. So recall that what I said was that hit list returns a list, or is a list of enemies, so this can't be greater than 0. That's what the error is saying greater than not supported between list and int. Of course not. It should be a len of hit list. In other words, if something got hit, then remove it. All right. There we go. So now we can shoot the enemy and it disappears. Cool. Okay, so I guess the thing that's left is to make sure that we get more enemies getting generated. Right? So I think in our update, we might want to check and see, if there's only like one enemy on the screen, then it's time to make a new enemy, or some number of enemies, right? So let's go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and make a variable in my setup called self.num enemies, and this might end up being like the level or something, but I'm going to go ahead and make this 0 for now. That's the maximum number of enemies on the screen at a time, so 3. Okay. So then what we'll do is inside of our on update, we'll say, well, if the length of self.enemies is less than self.num enemies, then it's time for a new one. Where do we want this new one to appear? Well, I'm thinking we want it at the top of the screen, and we want it kind of maybe randomly in the screen width. So I'm going to go ahead and say new enemy equals enemy. And remember, it's expecting an X and a Y. So I'm going to say random.randint. Let's make it anywhere between 0 and the screen width. Its Y, I'm going to make it at the very top, so that's screen height. All right. And its number will be any random between 1 and 3. So random.randint, 1 to 3. So we get random enemies. And then we'll go ahead and say self.enemies.append new enemy. Okay, so I'm going to run this. We've got 3 enemies shooting pretty. Ooh, that's going to be hard. Oh, there's a new one. Right. Now, 5 shots is probably too many. I'm not sure I can dodge all these and shoot at the same time. Right, so this is a little bit hard. They're also, moving forward a little bit slowly, and of course, they're not hitting me. So a couple things to change or to fix here. And they're also like flying through each other. So I think we want them to be spaced out a little bit more. I think if when we create the 3 enemies at the beginning inside of our setup, I think if we make them maybe farther from each other, that might help. So I'm just going to say for I in range, and we're going to get 3 enemies. Or rearrange it. So self.num enemies. So I'll say self.num enemies. We'll do screen width divided by, we'll do I times divided by self.num enemies. Right, so the first one will be at 0. The second will be at screen width divided by num enemies. So the second will be twice that far. So it should evenly distribute them horizontally. And then for height, we'll do the same thing, but it'll be minus 50 times I plus 1. And then this will be I plus 1. So it'll be 1, 2, and 3. Let's go ahead and see what that looks like. There we go. So see, we're getting all 3. They're spread out. I shoot that one, he comes back. I shoot that one. All right, so they're still overlapping. Still shooting a little bit fast, probably. Let's change how fast they're shooting. So remember, that would be inside of our enemy class. So the reasons we use classes, so we can kind of think about these in parts. So in our enemy class, we are allowing, right here, this is the number of lasers. So let's make it 3 instead of 5. Right, so okay, so not as many shots coming at me. Ooh, still some times where I can't really dodge. So yeah, that might be something to worry about. But yeah, so I think that's going to do it for this video. We now have our enemies appearing. They're able to shoot.